Hey guys, Will here. So today we're doing something a little bit different, answering a question that I've been wondering about for a very long time now. So I was recently chatting with the team at ASUS Australia, and they said that they had an AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT graphics card that they had spare, which they could send to us to check out for a couple of months. So I hadn't actually run an AMD card in any of my systems since the 9800 Pro way back in 2003. Now the reason why it's been so long since I've run an AMD card is quite simply because there hasn't really been anything, at least until a couple of years ago, that really kind of, I guess, sparked my interest and got me wondering whether it was worth even looking at the switch back from Nvidia, which I've been happy with for a good 18 years now. So today what we're gonna do is take a bit of a look at this 6800 XT, but we don't wanna sort of get stuck into things like benchmarking because there's already plenty of videos out there. This card's actually been around for a good year now. There's plenty of other videos that go into a ton of detail around benchmarking. Two in particular that I'll recommend that I've linked down in the description below is of course Gamers Nexus video, where they go into a massive amount of detail, benchmarking a huge range of different games, as well as comparing against a bunch of other graphics cards which you simply just don't have access to here at Boosted Media. Dan Suzuki, who is another sim racer, also did a really excellent video comparing the performance across single and triple screen resolutions against the 3080 as well as 3090. So definitely would recommend watching that video as well for more direct comparisons in terms of pure performance. But what I want to focus on today is more the experience of actually owning and using an AMD card as it stands here at the start of 2022. There has been a lot of complaints in the past about stability, driver issues, and I know that kind of thing has turned a lot of people away from considering one of these cards. But I'm also aware that in today's landscape, it's very, very difficult to get your hands on graphics cards at all. And therefore people are having to make sacrifices. People are having to consider things that they may not have otherwise considered. So the aim today is to address a lot of those questions that I had going into testing an AMD card, and hopefully giving you guys a clearer picture of whether it's worth considering an AMD Radeon card in 2022 for your specific needs. So let's get started. So let's just quickly highlight a couple of interesting features regarding this particular card. So this is the ROG Strix Gaming AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT, and you'll also notice down there the letters OC, which means it's the overclocked edition, meaning that from factory it does run slightly higher memory and core clocks than the base reference units do. Now you'll also notice this interesting appendage on the side here with some pipes coming out the top. So this is an all-in-one cooler, very similar to what you would have, in fact, pretty much exactly the same as what you would have on a lot of CPUs these days. And essentially what this is doing is it's piping the heat away from the core of the GPU and memory on the graphics card. So there's a water block, so to speak, sitting on top of the card, as well as a cooling fan here. So it's a bit of a hybrid kind of cooling situation. What happens is there's air blown across, and there's actually some vents in the front of the graphics card as well. So the basic cooling happens via active air cooling, and then additional heat is also passed out through to a radiator here. So there's a pump inside here as well, pumps through the vanes and fins inside the radiator, and then there's some cooling fans on the back of the radiator as well, which passes air through. Now the advantages of that are quieter operation. So what I found using this on the desktop is generally just sitting in the desktop, only the fan was just spinning very, very slowly. The fans on the radiator sometimes weren't even spinning at all, depending on what mode we had it switched into. And yeah, once we got up in gaming also, because a lot of the load was being taken up by the larger 120mm fans on the radiator, larger fans do tend to be a little quieter than smaller fans do for the same volume of air movement, so they don't have to spin quite as fast, larger fins on the fan. So what that meant is that we were able to maintain pretty respectable temperatures here under normal sort of gaming conditions on a single screen 1440. We were only seeing around about half the maximum power load on the graphics card, so around about 190 watts. This can go up to about 400 watts maximum power draw, and at those kinds of power levels, which is what you would typically see under normal sort of gaming scenarios, you know, this was extremely quiet, much quieter than a purely active cooled without water cooling graphics card would be at the same kind of power level. So we were seeing temperatures around sort of the 65 to 70 degree mark, which again is perfectly fine for a graphics card like this. When we started to push into higher resolutions with triple screens, did see that power draw go up, and that of course did increase the heat, and the fans came up as well, but still relatively quiet. And in fact, on the particular system that we were running this on, it was still quieter than the all-in-one CPU cooler that we were running on the system. And it's quite unusual to have the GPU be quieter than the CPU cooling solution under gaming scenarios. So provided that your PC case is conducive to mounting the 120 by 240 millimeter radiator, then yeah, definitely no problems at all with that. And again, we do see models of other graphics cards as well with similar cooling solutions. So just to cover that off quickly for you guys, I would definitely say the all-in-one cooler does appear to give you an advantage both acoustically and in terms of temperatures compared to a normal air-cooled graphics card. So yeah, I was quite impressed with how that operated. Now, just for reference, the test system that we were running this in was an Intel i9 9900K overclocked to 5.2 gigahertz on all cores with 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM as well. Now, one of the features of more modern Radeon graphics cards, they do have a technology called Smart Access Memory, or SAM. And what that does is it allows the system to better optimize the relationship between the graphics card and the system memory on an AMD-based system. Now, Intel-based systems do have a similar technology called resizable bar. Unfortunately, 9th generation Intel chipsets like what we were testing this with don't have that feature enabled, so we weren't able to use SAM or resizable bar for the particular test that we do here. So just wanted to quickly make a note of that for you guys. But again, check out the Gamers Nexus and Dan Suzuki videos linked down in the description for a, I guess, more comprehensive benchmark style video analyzing the performance of this specific graphics card compared to others. But really, what it comes down to at the moment is this particular card is, I guess, designed to be competition for the Nvidia 3080. So depending on where you are in the world, the prices can vary massively at the moment. It's just the nature of the way things are at the moment. Typically speaking though, this card is around about the same price as a 3080 is. But again, depending on where you are, I've seen the 3080 cost almost double what this costs in some situations as well. So do just keep that in mind. I know that stock is difficult at the moment, but just keep in mind that the prices do fluctuate a lot. So make sure you do your homework and don't just jump on the first card that you see. And that goes for AMD as well as Nvidia cards. It's just crazy at the moment. So make sure you are doing your research. So let's talk about drivers and software. Now, the Radeon cards actually had a pretty significant software update around about, I think it was around the start of 2020. So there was a new driver package, new software package that changed a few things around. The way this is presented now is quite clean and tidy, not like it was 20 years ago last time I used an AMD card. So all the settings and everything that you need to access quickly are all there. You can set up profiles for individual games as well, which is quite powerful. You can do that all in Nvidia drivers as well, but I found the interface just a little bit cleaner and a little bit more intuitive with AMD, which I was really happy to see. It definitely is an area that was in great need of improvement, but you can do everything there from taking screenshots, capturing video, and we'll talk about video capture in a little bit more detail a little bit later on in today's video, because there's a couple of important points around that and the onboard encoders that are used on this card. But yeah, look, everything that you need to access is all available there. The one thing that I was disappointed with though, and it seems to be a thing since this new version of the software in 2020, is they seem to have removed the ability to make Eyefinity adjustments on the fly within the software package itself. And what I mean by Eyefinity is the triple screen configuration. So while this card obviously can support triple screens, it's got 2 DisplayPort outputs and an HDMI output on this one specifically, but obviously that will vary depending on the model of the card that you're looking at. What happened was you're able to do the basic configuration of the quick setup, which allows you to, stretch your screen across 3 screens so that Windows sees it as one high resolution single screen. But what we weren't able to do is make any adjustments to things like bezel correction and, offset, things like that. Now, I did spend about a good half a day sort of researching this. I saw a lot of people were complaining about the same thing. Now, there is an executable file for Eyefinity hidden away inside a folder, and I'll put the path to that down in the description below for you guys. And that allows you to launch a separate application on top of the software package that does allow you to make some adjustments. Unfortunately though, they have removed bezel correction from this software. Now you can get around it by adjusting the horizontal offset, but it's quite clunky because you don't get any sort of visual reference on the screen as you're doing it. So it's kind of like a put the number in, check it, go back, change it again, change it again, change it again, and it can take ages and ages to get your adjustments right. Now, in my research around that, I found, as I said, a lot of people complaining about it. I actually did find an email which somebody had sent to AMD directly, their technical support, and they'd actually come back saying that they had intentionally removed bezel correction from the configuration tool. So I don't know the reason for that. I know that in the previous generation software, a lot of people were having a lot of stability issues with it. So it does sound like potentially they've just removed the feature rather than fixing it, which is disappointing for sim racers. You can work around it. You can adjust that horizontal offset, but It's definitely a lot clunkier than Nvidia Surround is, which is the equivalent Nvidia version. Now, I am really disappointed to say that because Nvidia Surround is an absolutely terrible piece of software. It's very unstable, often doesn't boot up properly when you start the computer and you have to go back in and recalibrate stuff. It's just a clunky, messy piece of software, and I really don't understand the reason why it's been that way for so long. So I was really hoping that the experience with Radeon there might be a lot better, but unfortunately it's actually worse. So yeah, it's a bit of a disappointing one there, and I don't really know the full reasons why they haven't looked at that. I guess triple screen gaming just makes up such a small percentage of the overall market that it's just not something that they're willing to invest the time in fixing at the moment. But hopefully that was something that will get fixed into the future. But look, otherwise the software experience was really good. Everything that you need is there. And as I mentioned before, the ability to set up configurations for individual games does work very well. It's a little bit tidier than the Nvidia equivalent. It essentially works the same way. It achieves the same thing, but it's just a little bit easier to work with and a little bit more intuitive, which I was quite impressed with. So overall, a big thumbs up for the software with the exception of Eyefinity. Now, in terms of the drivers, that was one thing that I was really concerned about. As I mentioned before, in the past, there has been a lot of stability issues with Radeon graphics cards, and that has been a big reason why people have turned away in the past. So all in all, I've put in well over 400 hours of game time on this card. I'm very happy to report I had absolutely zero issues with stability whatsoever. No system crashes, no freezes, no nothing. There are a couple of times where I had frame skips and things like that if I was really sort of pushing the graphics settings high and experimenting. But yeah, other than that, absolutely zero stability issues whatsoever, which I'm really happy to be able to say because that was a big concern that I had. But one thing I think is important to highlight there is that AMD obviously doesn't have the NVENC encoder. So for those of you who are recording your gameplay or streaming, that may have a bit of an impact. What I've found is that while the hardware encoder that is on these AMD cards does work quite well, had to push the bitrate quite a bit higher than you do with NVENC to achieve similar kind of visual quality. And what I found is when I bumped that bitrate up, it did start to have a more detrimental impact on performance. Now, running at, relatively medium to high graphics settings, so not really pushing ray tracing all that hard or anything like that, at sort of standard 1440 gaming resolutions, it was okay. The recording quality was fine and it didn't have too large of an impact on the frame rate. But when we started to push into higher resolutions, it was really sort of starting to struggle quite a bit. And I did have to start to make some sacrifices in terms of the quality of the recording or in terms of my quality settings inside the game to be able to get smooth gameplay and smooth recording simultaneously. So I did find that the AMD encoder does appear to be a little bit less efficient than the Nvidia equivalent, NVENC, particularly at higher resolutions and at triple screen resolutions in particular. So that's just one thing that I think is important to be aware of. Now, it was a little bit interesting because I did find that that wasn't necessarily consistent across all games either. So Control in particular, when I was playing that really struggled, really almost ground to a halt. And you can see in this footage that we're showing now, it was quite choppy when I was recording. But F1 2020, for example, and Red Dead Redemption 2, absolutely no problem. I was able to crank the settings up pretty high with those, even with triple screens, and still maintain pretty reasonable recording bit rates and visual quality, both in the game and the recording. So yeah, it really just seems to depend on the game that you're playing, and I'm not sure exactly the reason why. Maybe some of you smart guys in the comments can let us know. But yeah, the experience wasn't consistent in all cases. So a couple of other key differences for your consideration between Radeon and Nvidia. Another big one is, of course, Gsync versus FreeSync. So both Gsync and FreeSync refer to adaptive refresh rate technology. And what that essentially means in basic terms is the graphics card synchronizes the frame rate or the number of frames that it's outputting to your monitor or monitors with the refresh rate of the monitors. So what that means is that you get less frame tearing, less skipping and things like that. So essentially, if you're running a game that is only able to output, say, maybe 75 frames per second, but your monitors are able to run at 120 Hertz, obviously you're gonna have to repeat frames on those monitors to achieve that refresh rate at the frame rate that you've got on the graphics card. So what it does is it allows the monitors to actually slow down their clock speed or their refresh rate to match the frame rate of the graphics card. What that means is that you don't get things like screen tearing, juddering, and things like that. And there's plenty of videos on YouTube demonstrating exactly how this works, so I don't really see the need to go into too much more detail on it in the context of this video. But the important thing to understand is the difference between FreeSync and Gsync fundamentally. So FreeSync is an open source technology, and you'll find this as a general theme as we go through some of the other technologies in today's video as well. So in the AMD ecosystem, a lot of these technologies are open source, whereas with Nvidia, a lot of them are proprietary and therefore locked down. Now, the other important thing to note here is, of course, compatibility. So in the case of Nvidia, Nvidia graphics cards, you can use them with both Gsync and FreeSync compatible monitors. Obviously, the experience isn't guaranteed when you're using a Nvidia graphics card with FreeSync, and I have found that that experience does vary quite dramatically. In the case of AMD cards, generally speaking, they're only compatible with FreeSync monitors, not Gsync monitors. Nvidia has just recently opened up the technology to allow AMD cards to work with Gsync monitors, but again, the experience can vary quite greatly there, and it isn't compatible with every monitor. Some of the older monitors do have firmware upgrades available, which do enable that compatibility, but generally speaking, you will need a more recent monitor to get that functionality. So if you are wanting to use a Gsync monitor with an AMD graphics card and have that adaptive sync technology running, then just check that your monitor specifically is compatible and able to allow that functionality. Definitely something that's important. So let's talk a little bit more about visual quality and general gaming performance now. So the card that most people are going to compare a 6800 XT to is the Nvidia 3080, around about the same price point, at least at MSRP. And again, make sure you are checking pricing because it can fluctuate really crazy levels. So what I found was at 1080p, 1440 and even 4K resolutions, the performance was quite similar between this and a 3080. So playing games like Control, Red Dead Redemption, and most of my sim racing titles on a single screen, the performance was great. There was no major issues. I did find in a couple of cases I had to turn ray tracing down a little bit more than I would have to on a 3080 to get similar performance. But otherwise, yeah, the overall performance was quite good. And again, check out Gamers Nexus video for a whole bunch of comparisons there with exact frame rates between a bunch of different titles and different cards. It's going to give you a much better idea of exactly where this lands in terms of raw performance. But the main observation I had with the Radeon ecosystem compared to Nvidia is that the performance doesn't scale as well as you start to get into much higher resolutions. So once we got into triple 1440, what I found was that the performance of this was around sort of 15 to 20% lower in terms of frame rate than what we would have with a 3080, even though we had similar frame rates when we were running on single screen 1440p. And that actually got worse as we went higher and higher and higher in resolution. So at triple 4K resolution, the performance was quite significantly lower on this card. We were getting around about sort of 60 frames per second on a title where we would get 90 or even 100 frames per second on a 3080. So really, I think that's probably the key factor here, I would say. And I can't say unequivocally how that's going to apply to other cards within the Radeon range, but I think it's pretty safe to say, at least at this point in time, that triple screen gameplay just doesn't scale in terms of performance as well as it does on an equivalent Nvidia card. So keep that in mind as well if you are looking at picking one of these up for sim racing. I think if you're running triple 1080 or triple 1440, then, you know, if you are able to pick up one of these cards a whole lot cheaper than you can a 3080, then, you know, it might be worth considering. But I did find that even something like a 3070 Ti, which at least on paper should be slightly cheaper than this card is, still didn't quite have the scaling of performance at higher resolutions, even to the extent where the 3080 Ti actually performed slightly better than this did in most titles at triple 4K resolution, which I actually was quite surprised with, because this card outperformed the 3070 Ti at, you know, single screen resolution. So yeah, that was quite surprising and definitely something to be aware of. But another thing to consider is the technologies which are actually being utilized within the games that you're playing as well. So different games use different game engines. Some of them have different technologies. So DLSS, for example, ray tracing, simultaneous multi-projection is another good example for sim racing. Actually, let's talk a little bit about simultaneous multi-projection, or SMP. So normally with a triple screen setup in most sim racing titles, at least, you would have some sort of what's called projection correction, where you're actually accounting for the angles of the screens and adjusting the perspective so that everything looks in correct proportion when you're sitting in the driver's seat. Now, to achieve that, what the game actually needs to do is render 3 separate perspectives or 3 separate camera positions, one for each of the 3 screens, to account for those different angles. Now, simultaneous multi-projection, or SMP, allows you to actually make one calculation per frame for each of those, rather than having to render 3 separate perspectives each time. So it does give quite a significant performance boost. Now, unfortunately, that technology isn't available on AMD cards, at least at this point in time. We did find that in iRacing, where this is utilized, that did give us quite a significant performance boost, up to 10, maybe even 15% over not running that technology. So if you are running iRacing, that is definitely another thing to consider. And Dan Suzuki actually covered that in terms of benchmarks in his video quite extensively. So I definitely recommend checking that out. His experience was quite similar to ours as well there. Without running it, the performance was slightly better on the 3080 than it was on the 6800 XT, but switching on SMP in iRacing significantly improved the performance on the Nvidia cards. And with that technology not being available on the Radeon cards, it did kind of leave them lagging behind quite a bit. And the last major difference between the two that I found was just down to super sampling, some of the technologies around that. So Nvidia has DLSS or deep learning super sampling, whereas AMD has FidelityFX. Now the approach to super sampling is slightly different between the two, but let's first explain exactly what super sampling is. So super sampling allows you to render a higher resolution than the native resolution of your monitor to get a higher visual quality. And there's a couple of clever things that you can do within that framework to boost performance more than what you would get running standard native resolution of your panel. So say for example, DLSS or deep learning super sampling allows you to render a lower than native resolution for the general scene and then just boost the resolution in the areas where you're paying attention. So say for example, with triple screens, you're focusing mostly on the center screen or in the sweet spot of your field of view. So what it's able to do is boost the quality in just that area and lower the quality in other areas of the screen. That gives you a boost in overall performance whilst minimizing the visual impact of that lower resolution in areas that you're not paying attention to. Now the approach between DLSS and FidelityFX does vary quite greatly. FidelityFX, as we have on the AMD cards, uses an algorithm based on a single frame or the frame that's actually being drawn at the time. So what it's doing is it's basically interpolating information based on that single frame, whereas DLSS or deep learning super sampling actually uses a couple of previous frames which have been drawn as well. And then what it does is interpolate between multiple frames. So it has the benefit of knowing what's been drawn in previous frames, and it can kind of go, okay, well, this has changed significantly, this hasn't changed as much. And that of course is allowing it to draw upon quite a lot of additional information that isn't available within the FSR framework. Now, it's really important to understand here that motion graphics is quite different in the way your brain interprets it from a single image. So if you were to take a screenshot from FidelityFX and compare it to DLSS, you might not see a massive difference. But when you're actually looking at fluid motion or a motion picture, the difference can be quite significant. Now, what I found, just to summarize for you guys, is that FSR or FidelityFX tend to have a slightly softer look overall, but the detail didn't have quite so much artifacting. Whereas DLSS does tend to look a little bit sharper overall, but can get some weird artifacting going on, which is generally referred to as temporal artifacting. What that is where you've got a difference between two different frames, maybe if you're moving really quickly in a game or something like that. So the difference between two frames is quite large. What can happen is you can get some weird kind of ghosting and some weird sort of artifacting going on between the two frames. And that's just simply down to the deep learning not knowing exactly how to interpret or how to interpolate between those two frames. But my take on this, and feel free to disagree with me, is that DLSS does do a slightly better job overall. Just looks a little bit crisper and that little bit sharper, just brings a little bit more immersion to the game overall, but at the cost of that slight artifacting every so often. And some games are going to suffer from that more than others, and obviously depending on where you land with your settings as well will have a large impact there. But I mean, you know, with a high-end graphics card like this, particularly at single screen resolutions, a lot of people aren't going to be needing to crank those settings right up anyway. So it's only really when you're starting to really push the boundaries of the graphics card, having to really sort of rely heavily on super sampling to get better visual quality, that you start to see the stronger impacts of this. But overall, I would say, at least in my experience, DLSS is probably the superior technology of FidelityFX, and that's just simply down to it having more data to draw upon, so it just ends up giving you an overall sharper picture. So that's been my experience with the Radeon RX 6800 XT over the last couple of months. Look, overall very happy with the performance, really happy to see that the stability is good, drivers seem to be good now. I was disappointed that the Eyefinity controls weren't working properly, and that just made it really quite cumbersome to set up with triple screens. But I'd say, you know, if you're a single screen gamer running at 1080, 1440 or even up to 4K as they advertise on the box, then yeah, look, the card performs quite well. Obviously, depending on the kinds of settings you're using, the monitor that you're going to be using as well, those things will weigh into the decisions. But look, I think if you're able to get this at a similar price point to a 3080, I'd probably go with the 3080 simply because the performance does scale better with higher resolutions, as well as triple screen gaming, of course. And I do feel like DLSS just works that little bit better for you know, most of the games that I tested that are compatible. So yeah, I think overall the 3080 is probably the better choice, but if a 3080 is going to cost you 30–40% more than one of these cards is, again, depending on your situation, then you're certainly not missing out on a whole heap when it comes to single screen gaming with the 6800 XT. So I think if this is the best you can do at the moment, if this is the best your budget will allow for, or the best that's available, then you're not going to be disappointed with the card. But if you can get your hands on a 3080 for a similar price, then that would be my choice, particularly if you're looking at triple screen gaming. So hopefully the video has helped you out, guys. If it has, leave a thumbs up. Thank you very much to ASUS once again for lending us the card for a couple of months to test out for you guys. And yeah, we'll see you again very soon. Bye.